Hello and welcome to Let's Talk About, a series spotlighting leaders, authors, artists, marketers, creators, entrepreneurs, sharing tips and expert advice on business, media, technology, and frankly, life itself. I'm your host, Cynthia Nelson, three-time entrepreneur, Forbes contributor, investor, and advisor. Today, we're talking to Stephen Butler, co-founder and managing partner of Framework, an advisory firm for growth companies. Hi, Stephen. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cynthia. Great to be here.
Hey, I know we have this road less traveled kind of doesn't always go the direction we think it's going to go. So, let the audience know like what's your background, and then we'll kind of bring it up to the current state with the book and everything. So I'm very excited to talk to you about it.
Sure. Well, great question. I guess my journey is sort of a series of karmic tumbles. Starting off, I'm a recovering historian. As an undergrad, I studied economics and history and politics, and then went on to do a PhD in basically the origins of modern economic thought at Cambridge. Um, and that I then had sort of I guess, call to action when I was teaching at Harvard after I finished my PhD, from my wife to find something that was not going to have us moving around 5 times in 8 years, kind of thing.
Mm.
And I got an offer I couldn't refuse from the Boston Consulting Group, and that took me into a world of what I guess I would now call history by other means.
Yeah, definitely. That's very strange. You weren't like a Harvard MBA,
No,
Stanford going into, you're a Harvard PhD professor in, economics, politics. Like that's a very strange jump into BCG and a very different one.
it was different, although at the time I never made it. So just a full disclosure, I never made it to professor level. I was just doing a postdoc when I made the move. Um, but it was interesting at the time. Firms like BCG and McKinsey were starting to realize that they were growing very quickly. This was the late '90s. They could either go deeper in the hiring pool at the big business schools, or they could start to hire broader. They could start to hire actually from the top of other hiring pools. And in fact, that's where I met my co-author, Carissa Price, who's now Chief Marketing Officer at Dragon Fruit AI in Silicon Valley. And she and I were both incoming. We were called exotics, and actually, there's a little story about this in the book about our onboarding. But exotics were basically engineers, MDs, lawyers. In our case, Carissa she does have a PhD she has a PhD from Harvard in politics. We were basically being brought in to basically kind of spice up the mix, if you will, of the kind of business thinking they were trying to provide to their clients. And it was certainly a rewarding two-way street. Ended up being almost a 4-year journey for me before I moved on.
I can imagine from the people that are doing the work, and having you sprinkled in the exotics,
Mhm.
sprinkled in, right? Because you're coming from a totally different perspective and not from the business strategy perspective, from the global macro and microeconomic perspective. And just
Yeah.
giving it a very different, and I think a deeper, maybe
Hmm.
more human side of the business part. But, how did you guys decide to write a book? And first of all, tell us the title of the book, why you
Sure.
decided to name it what you named it, and what it's all about.
So the book is called "Why is a Verb," and the subtitle is "How Well-Managed Teams Turn Purpose into Productivity." Um, and the story of how it came about is well, almost not quite as tangled as my entry into the business world to start off with, but a close second. I So after becoming a corporate executive, after leaving BCG, I became a corporate executive for a decade. Then ran my own tech company for a number of years, and then found myself back in consulting. But the second coming was working with growth companies, just per your
Mhm.
introduction, per what I'm doing now, which was a very different environment. The Fortune 500 environment that Chris and I kind of cut our teeth in which she continued to work much of her career. Um, that's an environment where the stories of big successful companies that are told in the standard business books, like
Yes.
Good to Great and so forth, they
Yes.
really resonate, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I had one of my first, I was working with a very successful CEO, and really what we were doing. I was working with what was called the Growth Driver Program, which is a kind of an experiment at the time created by Canada's Business Development Bank for its sort of highest potential clients. It was really introducing the concepts around strategy for some of these guys for the first time, right? And what one of them was telling me in terms of his pushback, or what he hated about most business books,
Yeah.
was he said, I keep on reading these stories about how successful Amazon is and how successful Apple is and all the things that happen in their journey. And he said, that's a little bit like telling me, how Joe Smith chose his numbers for the winning lottery ticket, right?
Mhm.
It's not a repeatable story from their perspective, right? They don't have the scale, they don't have the location. A lot of these companies, and I'm talking not simply about companies that are in, high like tech centers like like Silicon Valley and
Right.
Toronto and Vancouver and so
Yeah.
forth,
Right.
but companies that are working out sort of in the hinterland, so to speak.
Yeah.
And again, some of these are 100, 200, $300 million companies, but they were simply saying these business books don't speak to us. So
Yeah.
the genesis of the book was under the auspices of my then employer, was to say, let's write something that really addresses these people's issues.
Super interesting because it's that whole adage, like we're not in New York, we're not in LA, we don't understand
Mm-hmm.
this whole Silicon Valley thing. We just run a successful business creating concrete statues that do, and these are huge businesses. These are
Yeah.
massive businesses that are creating things. It doesn't even have to be in tech, right? It could be in
Mm-hmm.
CPG or lawns, or it doesn't even matter. They're creating these big scalable businesses. But you're right, those case studies do not talk to them. And by the way, they're historical.
They're historical.
They're
You're
historical.
telling
And
somebody how a
no
success
one
worked.
ever talks about the luck and the timing of it
Yeah.
either. They just talk about, oh, they had this strategy, this is what they were going to do, and blah, blah, and blah, unicorn. I'm like, please
Yeah.
don't use that word
Yeah.
anymore. It's not like that. And, for every whatever successful business, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them that are successful in their own right, chugging along, doing 50, 100, $200 million. That's a great business.
It's a
That
great business. Yeah. And in fact, and so you really hit on it too, their histories, right? And so just to tie this back to the fact that I sort of started off as a historian, what always appealed to me about history was when it took our current thinking and put it in a different context.
Mhm.
And you can say, okay, we're wrestling today with let's say democracy, right? Just to shoot something that's not very businessy, so accessible. But then say, well, democracy is that mean the rule of law, or does that mean a particular system of voting? And what did in fact, why was democracy at the time of the American Foundation, for example?
Right.
Why was it a dirty word,
Yeah.
right? Why did George Washington not want to create a democracy?
Yes.
Um, so that was and so the same thing applies for business thinking.
Yeah.
And one of the things which really which sort of again triggered what was a sort of a more general book about
Right. Right.
just
Right.
developing a small company. Sorry, maybe getting ahead of your questions, but
That's okay. No, no, no.
the but what really jumped out was there were some things that I was noticing among my clients and my colleagues' clients that were the same issues that were starting to show up in some big surveys. That were about all companies at all levels. And so the single biggest one of them would have been the decline in productivity. And I think anyone your sort of your business your more business oriented listeners would know or at least have a sense that productivity growth in the United States, excuse me, peaked in 1954.
Mhm.
Right? We've been on a 70-year slide with some interruptions like the internet boom and
Yeah.
the pandemic blip, as I call it, sort of recovery from productivity shrinkage. But the general story, and that was the kind of thing that again, my clients were wrestling with. And then one thing that really, and this is what really became, I think, the DNA of what became Why as a Verb. It was a disconnect between the leadership teams of these organizations, often, somewhere between, let's say, 50 and 200 people in these organizations,
Mhm.
and everyone else. And one thing I began to notice was, and actually, sorry, it was really crystallized a few years later. And I think Krista was the first one to spot this. McKinsey asked 1,000 people in 2020, 2021, do you feel purposeful at work? Do you get meet, do you feel you're living your
I
meaning?
mean, right.
And among senior executives in this survey, 5 and 6, 85% said, yes, I feel very purposeful at work. Yes, I do live, I can live my why. Um, Among everyone else, Cynthia, so we're talking 98% of the workforce,
Yeah.
1 in 6
Yeah.
could agree.
Yeah.
And McKinsey called that the purpose gap. And that was effectively, they reported that in 2021. I would say around 2018 is when I began to see the purpose gap in organizations of all shapes and sizes, as did Carissa, which is basically how we kind of came together to work on this.
It's super interesting because you talk about the purpose and yeah, there's this gap between leadership and the teams that are working for them. And leadership is such a complex, I mean, it's a diamond with many facets in it, right? There's
Absolutely.
so many different pieces to it. And there's a lot of people that are very successful that are really, really bad leaders. And there's
Yes.
a lot of people that are not as successful, what we call fundamentally or maybe financially successful drivers in the organization that
Mhm.
actually are much better leaders, in
Yeah.
their team. They see these people growing instead of like growing them, moving and continuing moving them up. Well, they weren't the top.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter. They weren't the top performer, but they're a performer that can take people underneath them and grow them and keep them and move them within the company and keep them engaged. And that's a big skill that's missing. And the empathy
Yeah.
that has to go with that and the personality that has to go with that to bring people in and to want to listen to them and help them grow and really having that. We always talk about what is it, our service attitude towards client, our service heart towards
Service, yeah, service leadership, or yeah.
service leadership. The service leadership needs to be turned inside
Mhm.
towards the employees from management, and management needs to actually learn how to manage. It's not telling people what to do. It's hiring
Yeah.
people smarter than you and allowing them to do what they should be doing and encouraging them and helping them grow. And
All
again,
of them, yeah.
it's a whole skill set in itself that most people are never taught. We're not taught this.
So
Eh,
all of everything you just said resonates. And in fact, Gallup, with whom we worked fairly closely actually on certain parts of the book, and in fact, they're one of the. I mean, just to jump ahead, we've had some great endorsements of what we've done. Gallup
Yeah.
provided us with a blurb, and we had. Well, our forward is written by the Chief Human Resources Officer, Ty Breland at Marriott, which just a couple of years ago which is some 800,000 people. I mean, it's very
Yeah.
different from the 80-person organization
Yeah.
that I first thought I was writing
But
this for.
you have the
But
same
the but
pain, but at an 800,000 person level, right?
well, yes, yeah. And so the connection, so one of the things that connected in terms of that whole sort of concept of leader. Well, let me speak to what and how I ended up working with Carissa on this.
Yeah.
So I reached out to Carissa. Carissa was um, leading marketing for well, I guess the world's largest grocery company, which
Right.
not a lot of people realize is Walmart.
Yeah.
Um, and she was running the at least food and beverage and consumables there. I don't know if I ever titled exactly right, but I reached out to her just for a perspective on, hey, if this stuff I'm wrestling with, how does that resonate at your experience at? I mean, we would joke that she's not at a Fortune 500 company. She's at a Fortune 1 company
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
Walmart is the largest on the chart. And she said, you would not believe how much it resonates. I mean, there are, in a sense, Walmart and like all these large companies, like Marriott, in some senses, actually, I won't put those two in the same bucket actually, because Marriott's just become they've cracked the top 10 of the best places to work, and they've gone even higher this year. Spectacularly, very well managed company, but a lot of these companies are almost like clusters of little companies,
Hmm.
all the different teams. And so part of, there were areas of Walmart where people could not be happier or more engaged. And there are other areas where they didn't quite feel that way. And part of what, Carissa, when she began engaging with the process, with the project, I mean, she and I ended up having, I think it was a 2 or 3 hour, might have even been a longer conversation when I reached out to her, thinking it would be maybe, a 20-minute call. she at the end of the call before we hung up, she said, "I want to co-author this with you because this is something that resonates for companies of all sizes." Um, so that really was when things took off. Was when Carissa came aboard. Um, I don't want to be too self-aggrandizing, but it feels like that's when Lennon met McCartney. We had our dyads, right?
Having known her for a long time, I'm not surprised whatsoever. But what can readers expect to get out of it? Like, who is this for? Is it for
Sure.
small business, medium business? Is it for everybody who's managing and looking at people? And what are they going to get out of it? What are kind of the kind of big topics?
Well, let me answer the second question first, actually,
Yep.
because it's not a generic. We've had a couple of Amazon reviews, and they've all been very kind, right? We've got and we've been a bestseller in a couple of categories. Some of them sort of say this is like having a seasoned kind of business mentor walking you through the halls of modern management. I think that's almost a quote, something like that. But it's not that. That may be a side effect. What we were trying to zero in on was um, again, let's set aside the whole issue of, how do you make people better leaders, period. But there was one issue in particular, and it goes back to this purpose gap that all leaders were wrestling with, even some very, very good ones. And it was that, what is it that these employees who are not feeling engaged, what do they want?
Hmm.
And that question was a burning question. And we talked to, dozens and dozens of leaders, again, companies of all sizes, geographies, and so forth. Um, and what we sort of began to realize,
Right.
and actually, funny thing, that the most resonant thing for us, Cynthia, the most resonant comment was not from a CEO or a head of HR or not even someone at a Fortune 500 company. It was from a Gen Z working for a company in central Canada, who I hope gets to hear this at some point. Well, she'll see herself quoted on the cover of the book. He said, "Look, you're telling me all the time about the company's impact, but I want to hear about my impact.
He,
Stop." And in fact, she said, "I often feel like I'm a musician playing in a crowded room and I can't hear my instrument. I can't hear myself play. I need an amp." And that
that's amazing.
was our aha moment,
Yeah.
right? How do you build amps for those folks? And just sorry, one comment just too in terms of the number. When we try to put a number on, well, how much are companies? Is she just one data point, or is there something to back this up? We looked at a KMG report on the rise in corporate social responsibility reporting, CSR, um, and the surge in CSR since 2002 is remarkable, Cynthia. It's 3.5x. It's basically almost 80% of companies now above a certain level of size are sort of basically engaging in corporate social impact activities every year. And a lot of them are doing it because, well, they know it matters to customers, but they also know it matters to Gen Zs and millennials, right?
Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
are always telling them. But over that same period of time, from 2002 to 2024, employee engagement in the United States has gone from 30%, 3 in 10 engaged, to 30%. That 3.5x has had zero impact. And that really was for us, that was another aha moment. It backed up what we were hearing from this young woman in central Canada.
So as far as, companies looking at this and reading this, I mean, my imagination kind of is running kind of a little wild about the types of applications and things that they could do with this knowledge. And
Yes.
even when it's almost fresh knowledge, if they read it in a very open-minded state of like, I want to learn, I'm open to learn, right? The applications
Yeah.
could be endless because you're applying
So
something. It
we've,
seems like,
yeah.
if the engagement is here, all you have is upside. You only have upside to go.
Yes.
What are even the small things that you could engage your teams in, and finding out from them what's their North Star, what's their why, and being
That's
able to
excellent question.
apply that, and aligning that to the companies, or finding people that are in the wrong, even maybe in the wrong place in the
Mhm.
company, where they can have way more impact, in another division, or working with somebody else who is, better for them and better for their careers. Because it is the most expensive thing that we do in business is hire by far.
Yes.
It is the most expensive thing. It is not the real estate and the offices and the tech and the blah, 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 manufacturing.
Yeah.
It is the people that if they're not engaged and hungry and having fun and doing the things they want to do, and we've all, I think, maybe worked for a great company, and then we've
Mhm.
worked for a lot of mediocre companies, and that great company is the one where you're like, oh wow, we're still friends 30 years later. Oh yeah, remember when
Yeah.
we did this? We did this trip and we celebrated like this and we had these things. But that is not an easy
It's
thing
not an easy transition.
scale
No.
to create or
Well,
maintain.
and to go back, I think that's a wonderful way of framing it. And to go back to your comment about, again, so many, when you read a book like The Everything Store, let's say about the
Yeah,
success of
right.
Amazon,
Yeah.
Brad Stone's book,
Yeah.
great book, but
Yeah.
it's backward looking, right?
Yeah.
We can tell you why this worked as opposed to, looking at something where actually one of the more interesting books, I remember The Facebook Effect years ago. I can't remember the author, but it was all about how, in the early days of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg thought that Wirehog was going to be file sharing services where he's going to make all his money. Facebook was just going to bring in some
Mhm.
eyeballs for Wirehog. So that whole question of looking forward, that was a big sort of focus for the original sort of project this was born out of, and then the work that Chris and I have done together to produce the book was to sort of say, what do we actually see teams that aren't already at that top level of success? What do we see them doing that's trending in the right direction?
Right.
And that goes back to your question of, so who is this for? If in a sense we wrote it for leaders current and aspiring, and yeah, it can be in organizations of all sizes because they do have more in common, than they
Yeah.
realize. I mean, it can be to be in a now malfunctioning division of a great company, and I
Oh,
won't name
it's
the
such a,
companies, but I've got
got to
some.
be the most depressing thing ever.
It's tough, right? I've got several friends. I'm married to a woman from San Francisco, and I spend a lot of time in California, and so I see a lot of that of people going, "Well, I'm with this company everyone admires, but let me tell you, on the inside, I don't admire this very much."
Yeah.
Um, but to go so the solutions to get your question to what are we presenting to these people? It's interesting. I'll give you sort of the broad framework that
Sure.
sort of defines the toolkit, but just with the caveat that how this toolkit is used is going to change as the leaders change, right? I mean, we've got Gen Zs today. We look back, like purpose on the management agenda that was kicked off in 1973 by Peter Drucker, who
Right.
saw all
Right.
these conglomerates all over the place,
Yeah.
and he said, "You guys have got to figure out what is your focus before you figure out, before you can start creating value." You go by 25 years to the mid 90s, missions and visions are becoming a big thing. That kind of becomes standard. 25 years later, here we are, kind of in a sense, licking our wounds, right? I speak somewhat for many of the wonderful human capital people that I've had the opportunity to work with, saying, yeah, we kind of feel like we've invested a lot in purpose in the last 10 years and we kind of messed it up because obviously engagement isn't really moving.
Right.
And so the framework, but some of the, when I say aspiring leaders, think of a 25-year-old today,
Right. Right.
and or a 20-year-old today. In 25 years, they are going to be, well, leading teams, running companies, and so forth. And they will have been the first generation that came into the workforce prioritized, according to Gallup. It's really the global expert, in this area. Purpose over pain.
Yeah.
So what I'm about to describe will be used in two different ways. But let me just see, how does that sit with you? Does that make sense? That sort of two
Completely.
ways the same tool might get used?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Completely.
So in terms of the toolkit, we basically broke it down into sort of three things. Like, what does an amp need to do? And we figured, well, everyone who comes to work needs to know A, what's expected of them, what they need to do, what's the job, their accountabilities. Two, and this is a critical one, what tools do they need to deliver on those accountabilities, right?
Mhm.
You tell someone you want them to, build a wooden chair, you got to give them wood. They need some nails or screws or glue, right? All that. And there's many, many organizations, when you look at where management is misfiring, it's asking its teams to do something. And God knows there's so many Gen Zs and millennials that will tell you about this, but of course, people at all levels, they were asked to do something, but they're not getting the support that they need
Mhm.
to move forward. And the biggest single support, Cynthia, is concern from the manager. right? A lot of these set it and forget it managers, or who are, they're focused on their own level. They have an obligation to provide that feedback
Right.
to the individual. So we call it, so A, accountabilities, B, we call that resources, and C, what do I get? What happens if this works? And I'm not talking compensation. There's always going to be some kind of bonus structure, but really, what's the career impact on me if I get this right? So that's consequences. So ARC, that sort of becomes the overarching kind of framework, if you will, of all the tools that hang off them. I'll let you ask questions about which tool. You can zero in on whichever of those areas you're most interested in.
I'm just thinking, through that. It's a great, I mean, you could apply it to any company. And if you sat a
Mhm.
manager down and said, okay, ARC for this person, what is their accountability? What do they need to do? What resources are
Mhm.
you giving them? And what are they going to get out of it? I think a lot of them would have a really hard time with the third,
It's
with the
astonishing.
with the second and the third piece. And then you have to turn it back to, well, how would you feel if that was you? Do you know what your
Mhm.
arc is actually? Can you write? I
Yeah.
mean, almost kind of the litmus test, right? Is write down your own arc first,
Yes.
then
Absolutely.
ask your team to and realize how hard it is. If you don't know, how the hell are they supposed to know?
In fact, we see that as as sort of the way of kicking. And this, by the way, the whole ARC process is inspired by, in a way, there was a forerunner in this one dimension of the book, 23, 24-year-old book called Accountability, written by three great Canadian management consultants. One of them is an industrial psychologist. And the ground zero is to have an agreement between each manager and each report to define what are those things. And it's a negotiated agreement between both levels. It's also an evergreen agreement, so that it's creating a shape for a, could be weekly, shouldn't really be much less than monthly conversation between each manager report. What are you delivering on your accountabilities? What are you missing? And where are you going? And the biggest single thing in terms of where you're going, really for all of us, is, well, it's the biggest impact we have on ourselves, which is learning. What
Mhm.
are you learning from this? How are you growing your personal balance sheet in
Mhm.
doing this?
Mhm.
And I just got to throw in one comment, because it's just coming. Your questions have reminded me of this. One of my mentors, Cambridge, made the comment once. He said, "The mark of a great idea is it seems like someone already should have thought." And so, when we began working with companies on, this whole ARC framework and some of the things that hang off it, that was often a comment that was coming back from the clients, is that
Yeah.
they were saying,
Right.
this seems like, we should already be doing this. Um, so that was where we were.
It's super interesting. Where can my listeners and viewers buy this book? Where do they get it?
They can buy it. Well, anywhere, frankly. It's on Amazon. I feel like I've stepped on one of your questions. Can I just ask you asked where this is going in the future? There's one
Sure.
other element I just want to
Yeah.
slip in. But yeah, the book is available everywhere. Amazon is probably the most convenient place to get. Um, but the one thing, no, the one thing I just wanted to add was, we've had a lot since the book has come out. There's a little section in the book about AI.
Hmm.
Gen AI was just really starting to take off. And one thing that in the HR space, in the human capital space, the first wave of AI discussion has basically been, or how do we use AI in HR?
Right.
A lot of it was around, well, I'm going to ask ChatGPT to help me with my interview questions for a newly created role or what have you, which is fine. But it reminded us, Chris and I have been talking about this quite a bit. It reminded us of the early days of the internet, when it seemed like a big sort of digital mail order catalog, right? It was what we already did,
Yep. Just into
digitized. Whereas when this little company called Facebook came along, I mean, even then, Facebook was just gathering a bunch of
yeah,
existing Facebooks and putting
data.
them in
Yeah.
one place. But when they added that thumb
Yeah.
to the screen and it became possible, suddenly, I mean, social media, Cynthia, is the one thing I'm always impressed that no sci-fi writer, not even Philip K. Dick, one of the most visionary sci-fi writers of all, or Stevenson, who thought a lot about
Yeah.
AI and virtual worlds and so forth, no one imagined social media. So when we think about the future of these tools, and the future of AI in in the workplace,
Yeah.
and we sort of put out a paper on this actually called "The Joy of AI Anxiety." When we think about it, to some extent, it's unimaginable where
Yeah.
this is going to go. But one really interesting thought, and I've had this conversation just in the last couple of weeks. At the moment, if you think about how does a team or a leader figure out, what's the sentiment on the team? How engaged is my team? And another question might be, as an individual, like what's the amp for a manager, let's say?
Right.
And then what's the amp for a regular position? Well, today you've got some great solutions, and we talk about them in the book. You can make great use of things like pulse surveys, for example.
Mhm.
You know, powerful, powerful tool for helping leaders get that right. And at the individual level, peer recognition systems. I'm a huge fan of peer recognition systems. Basically, people giving each other's kudos and pats on the back and things that are captured. It creates a nice kind of real time sense of your own impact. Right, that's a really good end. But imagine AI layered on top of your Slack feed, telling the manager, you don't need to do a survey. We're going to run a survey on this for you. We,
Yeah.
we put a large language model on
Yeah.
top
Yeah.
of a chat
Yeah.
feed,
Yeah.
particularly in a huge company, and say, which areas of the company are nervous right now? Who's concerned about this merger? Who thinks it's an opportunity? And at the individual level, hey, I put out a report last week. Uh, which sections are the most commented upon,
Yeah. I got
right?
no feedback.
The
Nobody said it. Exactly.
and these are
That's a really great use of AI.
well, and
Positive.
I think it's the kind of thing, and we're not there yet. But this is the kind of thing when you think about it. This is the world of, and that's why I use the analogy of the early internet, right? We couldn't have imagined social media, so I don't think we fully imagined AI. But the biggest barrier we found to building apps, when we began talking to our clients and teams, was it just takes a long time to gather this information. By the time you got it, it's irrelevant. Whereas whatever bot you might put on top of your Slack feed. I'm just picking on Slack. I have no shares in
Yes.
Slack or anything, but
Yes.
anyway, or your Microsoft Teams. As
Yeah.
soon as you layer the right bot on top, and you can ask it any question you want, or have it generate a daily thing of, hey, at the last 5 reports I put out, what's the level of satisfaction with the financial forecast versus
Right.
versus let's say the market analysis. I don't think you could have 15%. I think your level of people who live their purpose at work, because purpose is fundamentally a feeling of impact,
Right.
it's going to be a lot more than 1 in 6.
Yeah.
So that's just what I wanted. I was excited about that question. Thank you for letting me get
Right.
that in.
Yes. No, no, no.
But
I'm glad you brought it. You brought it to kind of full circle. I mean, this is a fascinating subject and topic, and I think there's more uh, to be said. And I think that there are more books and conferences and things that you guys are going to be doing and leading with companies related to this because I don't think anybody can turn away. I think that it's
mhm,
here and now. And if anything of this generation and the one beyond it has taught us is that it's not changing. They are the ones who are going to
yep,
be running things. So if we actually want to leave companies, grow them in the right way and leave them to where they have legacies and can continue to grow, then we actually need to change. What worked before does not work now. So I thank
I
you
entirely agree.
for being on the
And
show.
if you and sorry if
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
I just add to that? If
Yeah.
you're just, I mean, if you're not a manager at all, if you're just an investor, right, and you've got your money in a just an index fund, and all you really care about is where's the S&P
Or say
500 going to
S&P.
go over the next 20 years, right? I mean, let's say if you're in your mid 40s right now and you're saying in 20 years I just want to know where this is going to be, you should really care about this aspect, because the thing that was most striking, I skipped over, I should have in one of your earlier questions, but we discovered through this UK study to really put a human face on what disengagement costs us. They asked people, well, what do you do every day? You know, how much time do you spend making hot drinks or talking to friends or
Right.
surfing the internet or
Yeah.
working on your shopping list versus what you're paid to do? The
Right.
answer in
You
terms of what you're paid to do, 2 hours and 53 minutes. That was the answer. Now, it wasn't the most scientific study, but I haven't met a single leader for whom that doesn't resonate, because if what we care about is growth of the market,
Yep.
and that's not just good for shareholders, that's good for
For
all human
everybody.
beings, right? We're right. Everybody benefits from wealth creation. If we can get people to go from 3 hours a day to 4 hours a day, over a
That's a
6 year
huge
period.
step. That's an overnight success step change.
That's overnight and over 20 years. We calculate this in the book, right?
Yeah,
They used to talk about, remember, it was Dow 100,000. I don't know if you
right.
remember that book from the late 90s, very exuberant at the time. So we tried to figure out, well, if you add these things together, how long does it take to get that to
Compounded.
Dow 100,000?
Our
You compound
compounding
it
interest
by
on productivity.
by 2045. If we can right size, if we can get the average company to get to the level of engagement that Gallup has identified in the top quartile company, that's the top quarter, the most engaged companies. If we can just level up to that level, we're looking at like Dow 160,000. We're looking at a very robust market. For anyone with some of the concerns about productivity and the market being a bit ebullient right now, I got to tell you, you're talking to a huge bull because I think a combination of the right people, the right tools, and hopefully the right attitude and the way of thinking about this, there's a lot that we can do. So anyway, thanks for letting me squeeze that in.
No, no, no. I think it's super important. Thank you so much for the book. Thank you for being on the show. And how do people reach out to you?
They can reach us. We actually created a company, Chris and I did, called Sagely, SAGELY.LTD. So if you go to www.sagely.ltd, you can find us there, a whole bunch of bonus content, access to the book links, of course, and soon the forthcoming audiobook, which is we're working on right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's been a pleasure.